You shouldn't try and make sense out of this, okay? Because you'll blow a fuse if you think this makes sense. Just remember, this is your plain old American scam that we're talking about.
All right, now we can't go too much further in this story without learning just exactly what the Federal Reserve does. Now, the normie definition says that it's there to stabilize the economy and to promote employment.
Its job is to promote employment and keep inflation in check.
Economic metrics in check. Unemployment and inflation.
But that's not all it does. Now, as we break this down, remember, the Federal Reserve was designed to confuse the American public. The real purpose of the Federal Reserve is to create money for the government. Now, one of the ways that the government can create this money is through treasury bonds. They're really just IOUs. The government promises to pay you back with interest, all while continually taxing you. Now, this is a great way for the government to spend more money than it takes in. Now let's look at the private banks. What did they get out of the deal? Well, they get rich off of the interest on the loans that they sell to you that they created out of thin air.
You shouldn't try and make sense out of this.
We start the cycle with a customer depositing $100. Federal Reserve rules say that member banks must keep 10% of what depositors give them on hand, or in their reserves. Now, in this case, the bank has to keep $10 in their reserves. The bank can now loan $90 of that initial $100 to another customer. Keep 10% on hand, that's $9, and now we have $81 to loan out. Keep 10%, loan out $73. If you continue this cycle 70 times, you can make $999.62. Now, in terms of $100, this really isn't that big of a deal. But when you have millions of dollars coming in deposits, well, you do the math. This newly created money dilutes the dollar as it infiltrates our economy. You see, it makes prices appear to go up, but what is really happening is the value of the dollar is going down. It's called a hidden tax because the money in your bank account may be just the same, but the value, the purchasing power of the dollar is going down. The Fed is creating money out of nothing. They give this money to the government, who gives it to the American people, among other places, who are being continually taxed in order to pay the country's growing national debt. Well, now that we have a basic understanding of how the Fed works, let's jump back into the story. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to cover. Last time we learned how banks can make their own money. Now, another term for this is fiat money. The founding fathers cleverly designed the Constitution forbidding the printing of unbased money. You see, they knew the dangers of fiat money based on their failed first and second tried central bank in the United States. Now, side note, the second central bank in the United States was heavily funded by no other than our favorite mystery family, the Rothschilds. George Washington despised fiat money. Andrew Jackson called bankers a den of vipers. Thomas Jefferson was one of the main objectors of a central bank, theorizing that it is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. So who did support a central bank? Well, one huge supporter was Alexander Hamilton, who has become incredibly popular these days. Now, his clever way with words glamorized debt to the average American. He even said, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing." He helped establish the first bank of the United States. His inspiration was the Bank of England, the empire that the Rothschild family created. Central banking was highly objected in the United States. Why else would the Fed have been created in secret and voted upon during Christmas holidays? What lengths would these bankers go to protect their wealth? How many coincidences must happen before they are mathematically impossible? Let's travel back to 1912 as we discover that some of these men involved in the creation of the Fed are continually surrounded by head-scratching coincidences. J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men of the world, was the owner of the International Mercantile Marine Company. The IMMC was a trust that subsidized several of the top shipping lines. The IMMC owned the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic. JP and some of his close business associates had booked first-class accommodations on Titanic, but they canceled days and in some cases hours before departure. Now, 3 of the world's wealthiest men would lose their lives on Titanic. The combined wealth of these 3 men alone was around $500 million. So here's the conspiracy. Apparently, these 3 men were strongly opposed to the Federal Reserve. They saw the dangers in fiat money just like our founding fathers did. So, does that mean that the whole thing was planned? Did JP know anything in advance? Or is it all just another coincidence? Now, I did a lot more digging into this story, and I couldn't believe what I found. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Last time I discussed a popular Titanic conspiracy theory, where 3 of the world's wealthiest men would go down on Titanic because of their supposed opposition to the Fed. Now, J.P. Morgan and his friends, who apparently supported the Fed, would coincidentally cancel their trip on Titanic last minute. Now, the world is full of Titanic conspiracy theories. We will never know exactly what happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about these men. I dove into the history of the billionaires who died on the Titanic and the billionaires who canceled their trips last minute. Was there any correlation between these men and the politics of the men that created the Fed? Well, as I dug a little deeper, I discovered that all these billionaires were of mixed political parties. I even found an article where Isidor Straus supports a central bank through the Aldrich Vreeland Act of 1908. This conspiracy was beginning to fall apart. Then suddenly I realized the Aldrich Vreeland Act of 1908 is a major missing piece to this puzzle. Created by none other than Nelson Aldrich, one of the Jekyll Island boys, the Aldrich Act was instrumental in creating the Fed. The Aldrich plan would create a banker-run central bank that could print its own money. They sold it to the public as a means of last resort during inevitable tough times. President Roosevelt, a Republican, signed this bill into law. Fast forward a few years to 1912, when Democrat Woodrow Wilson was running for president. Now, the Democrats hated central banks. Now, it's really important to know around this time that one of Wilson's very close friends was none other than Frank Vanderlip, one of our Jekyll Island boys. Then in 1913, Wilson signed the Fed into law, America's central bank. So what did Wilson get out of it? Alexander Hamilton designed the first bank of the United States, which paved the way for the Aldrich Vreeland Act of 1908, which paved the way for the Federal Reserve. The Rothschild-created Bank of England served as inspiration for it all. The Nathan Rothschild quote comes to mind. "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the money supply." Let's travel forward to 1915 to another maritime disaster, as we will see that our main characters keep popping up everywhere. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to cover.